Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi say. Okay, so we were in the middle of discussing the Nusach Hari and the beginning of changes to Seder HaTfilah from just the regular classical nuschayos that existed. Now, of course, we were makdim that there were many nuschayos, but ultimately they were more or less consolidated into two primary nuschayos and some odds and ends that remain, but Nusach Ashkenaz and Sfard. And then we said we were going to discuss the Arizal, being probably the first to try and kind of like mold two different nuschayos into one. Now, let's just say really, it's kind of an open question if the Arizal actually did that. What nusach the Arizal davened himself, and etc. And we'll try to get into that in some detail. Okay, so let's see like this. I just want to start. There's a sefer called Vikucha Rabbah. It's a sefer called Sefer Vikucha Rabbah. It was published many times. It had different names. It was published under the name Mitzvah Avodah. It was published under the name Shivas Nafesh. It's an old sefer from the early 1800s, written most likely by a Talmud of the Tzemach Tzedek, a Talmud of the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. And in it, it's likely a work of fiction, but what it's trying to do is, it's called a Pulmus al Darka Shel Chassidus, and it's a Vikucha Rabbah between a Chassid and a Misnagid. And ostensibly what it is letters back and forth. Primarily the Chassid answering gets a lot more of the eartime than the Misnagid asking, obviously. But it's basically letters back and forth from a Misnagid and a Chassid who had once upon a time been friends, who had learned together. And now the Misnagid, who's very turned off by what he hears the Chassidim are doing, is writing a letter to an old friend of his who he still trusts. And the old friend goes through in great detail to explain to him like why he's wrong. And the names given is the Misnagid's name is Rabbi Yamin Zev of Slonim, who's billed as a Talmud of the Gaon Mivilna. Maybe yeah, maybe no. And his compatriot who's writing back to him is Rabbi Yosef of Nemirov, who's a Talmud, and if you pay attention just to the titles that are given, it already tells you the slant. A Talmud Harav HaTzadik HaKadosh B'tzina Kedisha Chasidu Prisha Aspaklaria Meira Hareinu V'Rabbeinu Harav Reblev Yitzchak B'Radich of Zatzal. So just no bias, straight down the line. There's this Vikucha Rabbah that's given to explain, so to speak, the Chassidish position. Now the truth is that I was going to use the sefer to discuss Nusach Sfard, which is the Chassidim daven, but it's more apropos to discuss Nusach Hari, and I'll tell you why. Because the sefer, B'yodim or B'lo possibly the Mechaber was not fully knowledgeable about all the minutiae that create these distinctions, is a very Chabad sefer. Much of the tainus and the minhagim that he's discussing are unique to Chabad, in contrast to the general Chassidish population, or called to the other Talmidim of the Magid. In particular, in regards to Tefillah, where Chabad, the Alter Rebbe, published a siddur that's much more of a Nusach Hari siddur than standard Nusach Sfard of Chassidim, and that's what a big chelik of the sefer is spent defending. Other of them are more in the weeds, Chassidish Zachen, like defending the Darkei Avodah, which is particular to Chabad. And there's something about tshuva that's particular to Chabad, and the Indian of Hispilus, which is particular to Chabad. Meaning, and this is, I'll be honest, a little bit above my pay grade, but the Chachamim who've gone through the sefer believe that. So the sefer is ultimately more of a Chabad theological retort to a Litvisher critique, and it's an interesting sefer. But the reason I bring it up is because a big portion of the sefer is to defend the position of Chassidim to be able to daven Nusach Hari. Meaning the Shayil, the Misnagid in this conversation, Rabbi Yanim of Slonim is asking, of Slonim, how you talking to change the Nusach? You daven Nusach Ashkenaz, Mechatesi, you're allowed to change to Nusach Hari. And to which this Rabbi Yosef Nemirov, who's responding for the Chassidish side, explains in great detail about the tremendous amount of care and caution and wisdom and Havana that went into crafting what's known as the Nusach Hari. And therefore that Nusach Hari is much more bevusas and accurate than any other Nusach that a person could daven. And therefore everybody is able and should daven Yen Nusach. Now, the Nusach Hari that he's discussing and the amount of detail that went into crafting it is primarily what we would refer to today as Nusach Hari that Lubavitch davens, the Alter Rebbe's Nusach, who his in the various places that his children and Mamshich Darke describe the work that the Alter Rebbe put into the Siddur, it's clear that he made like a ground-up attempt at making a Nusach Hari. Meaning he didn't falazich on the various different Siddurim that other Chassidim used that have, questionable provenance, each one of them, how exactly they come by their claim as being Nusach Hari and are, for better or for worse, full of mistakes. Even the Sidurei Habesh that are in Lubavitch's collection in the big library down the block from 770, I think item 1 in the collection is a Siddur Hari. I'm sorry, is a Siddur Habesh. And one of the other items, these are two Siddurim that Baal Shem Tov himself used, are primarily Nusach Ashkenaz Siddurim with Kavanas on the side or with minor annotations to make them more Nusach Haridic. But they're not properly Nusach Hari. The Alter Rebbe, on the other hand, he created a Siddur that was much more Nusach Hari. And Chabad today davens Yana Nusach Hari. And if you look, the Tzemach Tzedek is quoted as saying that when the Alter Rebbe made the Nusach, he had 60 Siddurim with different Nuschayos, and he chose a Birur of a Liban from all those Nuschayos. I saw the Rashab writes that it took the Alter Rebbe 20 years to Kleiba his Nusach, to make Nusach Hari. So in the Sefer Vikuch Rabbah, in the defense that it's giving, it is primarily defending the Nusach Hari as in the Chabad format. So I'm going to put it aside in defense of in its relevant to actual conversation. But I think it's just fascinating to see what a primary role the Shina and Nuschayos and davening a different Nusach played in the Mulchama, in the early, fights between Chassidim and Misnagdim. And Ad Kedei Kach, obviously, if you look at the old Kolkeris, the original Kolkeris that were published in maybe Brud, or I think Brud, the original Kolkeris from 1732, the first round of it, includes in there, I believe it's in Yiddish, the Kolkeris, but it includes in there the Taina, that the Chassidim are just changing the Nuschayos as they see fit. So now, in any case, and we'll probably continue, we'll get to eventually to the actual Halacha Shaila, in regards to changing Nuschayos, and over there's a tremendous amount of literature from when the Chassidim were on the scene, and maybe we'll do that next week. But for now, I want to talk about the Nusach Hari. So we spoke last week about the Arizal himself, and we explained that the Arizal came probably from an Ashkenazic father, and until a certain age, he definitely was raised Ashkenazi, let's say, in Eretz Yisrael by his father. Later on, when he was a Yasam, they moved to Egypt, and he lived under the auspices of his uncle, and his uncle was Sephardi, and the Chevraya that he associated with was likely Sephardim, although the Radvaz and Rabitzal Ashkenazi, the Baal Shita Mekubetzes, were also Ashkenazim in a Sephardic world. But for, to each one in his own way, to greater or lesser degree, they were all practicing Sephardim. So that Arizal definitely had this crossover of being a little bit of both. Now, what's interesting is this is a famous line from the Chassam Sefer in his Tshuva, in Archaim, in Siman Tesvav 2. The Chassam Sefer has a famous line over here, and just we'll open with this. The Chassam Sefer writes, the shaila that's being presented to them is an interesting shaila, and it has to do a little bit with the Chassidim, is that there's a question about a chazan who's wearing specific clothing made out of tzemer, and there are misnagdim, who in this case Chassidim, who are saying that he's not allowed to daven with that tzemer, it's misnagid to whatever the tefillos that they're doing, and it doesn't work with the nusach, and etc. Now the Chassam Sefer over there goes off on a little bit of a tangent to explain Kilu Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard, and he explains as follows. He says, Kvar galisi daiti l'chol ha'imdim l'fonai, ki kach kibalti mirabayis etal. This is what I was mekabel from Rabbeim. Ve'meiri agoyin ha'chassid shebekahuna, Rav Nassan Adler, ve'agoyin Rabban shechol b'nei agoyin lahaflo, who was a chassid, Hashem meimeim shasisi, from their waters I drank, Mekayim chatzavti, ki kol ha'neschayis shavis. He says what I was mekabel from these great Rabbeim, who are both mekubalim in their own right, is that all the neschayis are equal, zu kazu, v'chol sheyesh bezu, yesh bezu. Every nusach has what every other nusach has. We don't know how to extrapolate it and how to isolate inside the nusach which kavanas and what you're supposed to be angling for and be mechaven for by each specific part. Each nusach it's just a little bit different. He says, "Ukashaban nerha aloiki Arizal v'izin v'chika v'tikin ki huyada teichen advarim." The Arizal was Masada Kavanis, like if Chaim Vital Shar Kavanis brings down in Priyatz Chaim and various other places where the snippets of the Arizal's Kavanis, who hemid b'sidorim kol davar al mochayna v'gilit halumas shal hanusach hahu asfaradis. He was megal of the depth and the richness and the Kavanis of the nusach Sfarad. Svaradim. This doesn't mean nusach Sfarad like Chassidim. Svaradis meaning Edot HaMizrach, like Sfardi nusach. Yan ki huwa Svardi, because he was a Svardi, so he was giving the giluyim for the nusach that he davened. Ilu haya hu Ashkenazi, if he would have been an Ashkenazi, oy haya nimtzav Ashkenazim, or he would have been around Ashkenazim, ish kamayu, haya oisa, or if there would have been by the Ashkenazim a man like him, haya oisa ki yoytzav b'zeh b'seder Ashkenazi, v'ata b'deris ha'achrenim abam b'seder Hashem, dailem shem vinim devei Arizal. We can't do more. To which the Chassam Sefer continues on, and he says, in Memela, any large whole-scale changes of a whole kahila switching over to say Nusach Hari, he says is unnecessary, because the Nusach that the Arizal, that all the tefillah has, is all-encompassing. Every Nusach that we daven has in it all the kavanas, and like the Rekeach writes in the Hakdama to his kavanas atfilah about in the Sefer Pirusha Atfilas, the I think it's actually called Seidus Atfilah Leval Rekeach. The Rekeach writes in his Hakdama how Chazal placed so much depth and meaning and kavanas in each word, and it's a direct Kabbalah that we have. He says his Kabbalah is from Rabbeinu, his father Rabbeinu Shmuel HaKadosh ben Rabbeinu Kleinimus Hazakim ben Rabbeinu Yitzchak, and they got from Rav Goyin Migoyin ad Rabbana Moshe ben Rabbana Kleinimus Yevi HaMelech. He continues all the way up to Shimon HaPakuli. So, like we know, every Nusach the Tefillah is rich and full of kavanas. Grada, we don't have the kalim to understand it and to isolate it, to extrapolate it from it, and therefore the Arizal went, what the Arizal gave, he gave on Nusach, on Sfaradi and Eidot Mizrach, but every person should daven how he davens. He says, but someone who's Ba B'Said, B'Said, and he understands the Saidus, and he wants to daven like the Arizal, so individuals could daven like the Arizal, but to make large, wholesale changes that everyone should daven like the Arizal, that's nish. That's L'chum Sefer. Now, the interesting line in there is that the L'chum Sefer presumes that the Arizal was a Sfardi, and therefore he made Nusach Sfardim. Now, most of the Achronim, who talk about the Arizal, either before or after the L'chum Sefer, do not agree with him and hold that he was an Ashkenazi, B'Yisod. L'mashal B'Chida and the Divrei Chaim and Mechas Elazar, Rav Chaim Vital in many places refers to him as a Ashkenazi, Rabbeinu HaAshkenazi, Meir Papers, Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, many of the Gedolei HaMekubalim, Chulga Mekubalim, who were Mamshichei Darkei and Mafitzei Teirasei of the Arizal, those who spread far and wide the Arizal's Kavanas and Halachas and etc., seem to have always framed him as being an Ashkenazi. And the presumption, they don't agree with the L'chum Sefer's outcome. The truth is that since the Gurei Ari and the circle of Talmidim that surrounded the Arizal were primarily Sfardim, so the Arizal gave over the Kavanas and the Nuschayis for Sfardim. Others say that because of Chaim Vital, who the Arizal saw as his main job coming to Tzfas was to be Misakin and to teach Rabbeinu Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital himself in Sefer Chazionis writes about this in several different ways. So the Arizal primarily shared Kavanas for Nusach HaTfilah Sfaradit, Eidot Mizrach, in order to complete his mission of educating Rav Chaim Vital. Now, in any case, be that as it may, it's pretty clear that the Arizal, according to most, was an Ashkenazi, and it also is pretty clear that most of the Kavanos HaTfilah that the Arizal gave over, interspersed throughout the Shara Kavanos and throughout the Priyetz Chaim, and whether it be Mefurish or whether it's a Diyak, were given over based on Nusach Sfaradi, a siddur for the Eidot Mizrach. Now, Ad Kedei Kach, there is a particular siddur from Livorno that was published, the year escapes me this minute, a siddur published in Livorno that Rav Chaim Vital was working with, that is the primary siddur that the Arizal annotated and gave corrections either in Nusach or in Kavana to the siddur. So it seems pretty clear that the Arizal was giving over, either because he was or because the Talmidim were, the Kavanas and the Seder for Nusach Sfaradim. So now, so I just want to read. So that's the Arizal's Nusach more or less. Now the truth is that there was no Siddur published for a very long time that was called Nusach Ari. During the Ari's Tkuf and Rav Chaim Vital's Tkuf, and even later, there was no Siddur published that was called Nusach Ari. It's a little bit later. I think Reb Meir Papers published a Siddur Ar La Yesharim. That was a Nusach Ari Siddur, and then many other versions of the Nusach Ari Siddur, but they were primarily Sephardic Siddurim that had the Nusach Ari attached to them. Now, what's interesting is that the Arizal himself probably didn't always daven Sephardi, or maybe didn't ever daven Sephardi. It's really, really hard to know. If someone wants to read about this in great detail, the Maramakim that has on this Arichos is in Shroshim and Ashkenaz from Rabbi Hamburger and Chelik Hay. The Sefer is all about putting on Tefillin and Cholamayid, but in the middle there, before he goes into the Arizal's minig about Tefillin and Cholamayid, he takes a long deep dive into the Arizal's status as a Sephardi, as an Ashkenazi, his particular minhagim in regards to Tefillah and other things, and it's Hadvar Aruchim B'Yoser, and I will not be able to say everything that he does. Suffice to say that he brings a lot of evidence that the Arizal himself oftentimes daven Ashkenaz. And what's pretty clear, he brings from I forgot the name, it's Mati Yonason maybe, that as follows: the Arizal had times, the Sefer called Kesas Yonason, where the Arizal would split up his tefillas, meaning on a regular day. I'll read you what he says because this is interesting. He says, "Shemati mipi Talmid Chacham meshulach kahal kadosh tzvas tibana v'tekonim meher b'yameinu sharav hagadol isha alekim the Rav Agoda Kamirin or Rav Yitzchak Gloria Ashkenazi, the Arizal, Hayim Espalo Kol Hashanim at Tzibur Shel Sfaradim. We daven the whole year with the Tzibur of the Sfaradim. Ach v'rak b'yam ne'roim. Only in Yam ne'roim u'b'shleisha regalim Hayim Espalo Ashkenazim. On Yam ne'roim and Shalosh regalim he would daven with Ashkenazim. V'chara lehem. And Ashkenazim were very troubled by this. Probably the diak is because he was an Ashkenazi, and how come he's not davening with them? Shalom imenu lama le'mispal kol hashanam at Tzibur Shel Ashkenazim. Why don't you, the Arizal, who's an Ashkenazi b'Makar, daven with us all the year? Why are you not davening with us? Which again gives some sort of indication that the Arizal might have been davening Nusach Ashkenaz himself. Heishiv lehem elu ve'elu divrei likim chayim, ach v'rak betfilas svardim yesh yosim rizmoirim, v'kama bakoshes, v'oimrim ba'atzibur shachris mincha avidoi. Says there's a few components that I appreciate about Svardik davening. He says they have more mizmoirim, some more bakoshes that I like, and they say vidoi, shachris mincha. The Chassidim rather don't, but they say vidul. It seems better to me to daven with them. So now the Arizal again is there's a few things over here. First of all, he says this line which is what the Chassam Sefer is paraphrasing, and I want to show you how Rav Chaim Vital says that even more extensively. But so they're all valid neschayos. Sai Ashkenaz, Sai Svaradim, these are all valid neschayos. But he says there's a particular some of the tefillas that I appreciate, and therefore I daven with the Svaradim. Now, how the Arizal was able to change the nusach that he was davening is a nidin in the Paiskim, meaning, which we'll get to next week in Ritz Hashem, in the tshuva from the Maram Shik and the Minchas Lazar and etc. Or and possibly the Arizal was Baba Said, he was from the individuals who could tweak. Or alternately you could say that Arizal himself did not really change his nusach. He davened nusach Ashkenaz primarily, and he changed certain minor details to adapt to them. Now this is a point of great contention. I can't take a position on this one way or the other. I would say it seems to me likely from the preponderance of Rav Chaim Vital's diukim in the Arizal's tefillah, and how he says he was sitting near him, and he says he watched him so closely, and he saw the Arizal daven. It sounds to me like the Arizal was probably davening from a Sephardic siddur, a siddur that Rav Chaim Vital himself had a version of, and that's the primary nusach that Arizal was going with. Mitzad Sheni, there are other times in the Kavanas HaTefillah throughout the Kisvei Rav Chaim Vital where he clearly references the Arizal's Nusach Ashkenaz Machzer. He's talking about Yom Kippur, he's talking about Yom Tif, and he references that the Arizal's Nusach Ashkenaz Machzer. He also says sometimes that he wasn't with the Arizal, like on Shushan Purim and other times. So you see there are times, Yom Tovim, throughout the year, that the Arizal would daven Nusach Ashkenaz, and it seems there were times throughout the year that the Arizal would daven Nusach Sfard, to which just bolsters this Nekuda that the Arizal himself seems to have held, that and there was a particular preference that he had. He enjoyed the piyutim of Rav Lazar HaKalir, which I primarily found in the Nusach Ashkenaz Sidurim, so he would daven those. So the Arizal himself seems to be maybe not promoting for everybody, probably not crafting a siddur, certainly not crafting a particular siddur, is primarily davening from a Sephardic siddur with minor annotations and kavanas, and is also sometimes of the year davening from an Ashkenazi siddur, and presumably again being moisif his kavanas and annotations. Now, with this all in mind, it makes perfect sense. This quote that's brought down that everyone knows from Rav Chaim Vital in the Shara Kavanas, he brings as follows. And I'll read you a little bit because this is like the building block, the anchor for the Nusach. It says, "V'amnam be'ikriya min hagim atzmam, sheyesh afreishim rabim v'shinuyim rabim bin Nusach HaTefillah b'atzmam." We find a tremendous amount of distinctions and discrepancies in the Nusach HaTefillah. Chutz me'inyan ha'pazmainim, except for the inyan ha'pazmainim v'apiyutim ha'neisafim b'tech HaTefillas, which Rav Chaim Vital believes to be secondary, less important, less consequential. Ela b'nusach habrachas v'atfilas atzmam yeshinuyim rabim ben sidari atfilas b'minik Sfarad b'minik Catalonia b'minik Ashkenaz k'yotz b'zeh. Now this is not nusach Sfarad like Chassidim. This is Svaradim. It says we find between the Ashkenazim, Catalonia, and the Ashkenazim and the Svaradim various different nuschos. It says hine be'inyan hazeh amali meiri. My Rebbe, the Arizal, told me as follows: Sheyesh b'rakia yud beis chalonis. There are yud beis chalonis keneged yud beis sha'arim. Keneged the 12 sha'arim in the war in Shemayim. V'chol shevet v'shevet oilet tefillah derech sha'arach and miyuchad loy. And every shevet has a specific sha'ar that his tefillas rise through. Ve'im soid yud beis sha'arim and eskarim b'seif Yecheskel. V'ni ein safek him tefillas kol hashvatim ha'yeshavas lo yitzarech li yud beis chalonis. If all the tefillas of the shvatim could be equal, you wouldn't need yud beis chalonis. V'sha'arim v'sha'arim. V'chol sha'ar yesh l'derech b'pnei atzmai. Elavada, he says, mucherchu, it's you have to assume, you have to presume, shekivan shem tefillasei mishonos, since each Eda and each one of the Shvatim has a different Nusach HaTefillah, l'chein tzrichim sha'arim miyuchadim l'chol shevet v'shevet. You need a different sha'ar for each shevet v'shevet. Ki kivi sherish u'makar neshamas ha'shevet, hahu, kein tzarech li yisei the tefillah. Kifi the sherish and neshama of each shevet is how to say that tefillah has to be. L'chein royal l'chol echad v'echad, L'hachzik keminig seder tfilasei keminig avaisav. Therefore, he says, and this is a very, very important line, a line that later got lost and changed, altered by the Chassidim, is l'chein roi l'chol echad ve'echad l'hachzik keminig seder tfilas minig avaisav. Nobody should change. Everybody should do like the minig avaisav. I've asked him a frag in that reason himself. Good question. If he she'enanu yedea mihu mishevet zeh u'mihu mishevet zeh v'kivin she'aveiseinu hechziku b'minig ahu ulai hu min hashevet ahu aroi lo yoseh minig. And since your forefathers were noyig in a particular minig, it's possible that you come from that shevet. And your tefillah really is supposed to go up in that original way, and you're changing it. Now, the Arizal, through his Talmud of Chaim Vital, is strongly positioning himself and saying, all Nuschayis have the same kavanos, all Nuschayis have the same depth, richness, and meaning, but there's different sha'arim, different, all roads lead to Rome, but there's different roads, and therefore you have to use the road that's for your shevet, for your chelik HaKlal Yisrael, and that's why there's different Nuschayis. Now, the Arizal himself, as we know from Chaim Vital in various places, and more explicitly discussed by his son Rav Shmuel Vital in the Shut Be'ermayim Chaim Siman Yutas, he says that the Arizal himself was Mevar the Nusach Sfarad, and he writes, and I'll read you, he says, B'sei that tefillas, anachnu holchem achri derech mizrach hashemesh, ha'ma'ar gadol meir la'aretz la'darim, shnig la'aleinu, v'chulu, many titles, ha'makobel ha'chasid, kameri lori Ashkenazi zatzal, achrav kam talmidai, that's his father of Chaim Vital, v'chulu, and they did all the editing and the annotating and kavana organizing, etc. for Sfaradik Nusach, and therefore that's the ultimate Nusach to daven, he says. And they fixed it, they based it, they sourced it with all the Sifrei Kabbalah before them, and therefore that's the Nusach to go with. So the Arizal himself seems to have davened primarily Nusach Sfarad according to Shmuel Vital, and because that's where he established the Nusach. Now, if you'll ask me the Stira, the Arizal, Rav Chaim Vital is bringing him down, seems to be saying that it's usher to make shinuyim, or I don't know if he'd say usher, but that it's not suitable, it's not beneficial b'chal to make shinuyim because you could be losing your shevet. So he says, Mistami, you have to say that the Arizal knew exactly, which shower he goes through, and that's why he chose that one, to daven with, meaning his particular composite tefillah was the Yosef Bar V'Nachan and Mesuder B'Amitas Kenoida. And this is the Marit Tzemach, Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, and the Sefer Zer Zav brings this down. Now, Al Kapanim, so this is the Arizal's himself tefillah. So it comes out that the Arizal's tefillah, I would say, to summarize, to encapsulate what we said until now, it would be safe to say that the Arizal himself was an Ashkenazi, who knew how to daven Nusach Ashkenaz, and various times throughout the year, certainly daven Nusach Ashkenaz like the ancient Makar. He clearly had Sidurim that were Ashkenaz, he davened that Nusach. Now, it also seems clear that the bulk of the year, on our standard weekday day, and probably every Shabbos, although that's a tiny bit of a discrepancy, he would daven Nusach Sfaradim primarily. We don't know if he made all the Shinuyim that Sfarad and Ashkenaz have, because there are many times that Chaim Vital references like specific Shinuyim to do the Sephardic way, and he writes V'chein Noag, Meiri Arav, and not to do like the Ashkenazim, which implies that the standard setting on the Arizal's tefillah might have been like the Ashkenazim, which is why I say it's a point of great contention and confusion as to what exactly the Arizal himself davened. But clearly the tefillahs that were given over and the kavanas and the schais that the Arizal gave over were primarily on the Nusach HaSfaradim, and therefore most of the Sidurim that came out originally with the Arizal's kavanas were Nusach Sfaradim. And like I said, Rav Chaim Vital was particularly using a siddur from a Venice published siddur from I think it's I have to remember the year, maybe I don't remember exactly, 1620, maybe 1625, 1624. It was a particular siddur, and in the later svarim that try to figure out how to craft siddurim, there's a lot of questions about how much weight to give to diukim in Rav Chaim Vital when it comes to nusach, how much needs to be explicit. And that's not really the tachlis of our discussion today. Al Kapanim, we're just trying to isolate what the actual original Nusach Hari was. Now, there are other Nuschei Kabbalah. L'mashal, there's a Siddur Rashash, and there's a Siddur Hashalah, two Kabbalah-centric or Kabbalah-focused Nuschei HaSiddur, that again purport to be primarily based in the Kavanas realm, Al Kapanim, on the Arizal, and each one of them has minor distinctions. And possibly we'll circle back to one of them at a later date. In particular, the Siddur Hashla is interesting to me because he introduces several new tefillas that became very popular. As everybody knows, there's certain tefillas that we say from the Shla, certain particular times of the year, and because of that, that's very interesting. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the Chassidim in their literature that we'll get up to, in the Chuvas that we'll get up to, refer to the Nusach they're davening as Nusach Hari. Now, it's pretty clear from the the Iker sources that describe the Arizal's Tefillah himself, that the Arizal was not davening the way the Chassidim are davening now. It was more of a Sfaradi Nusach and sometimes Ashkenazi, but not Nusach Sfarad like the way the Chassidim are davening. And now, there are many, many, many differences between Nusach Sfarad and Sfaradim. As a matter of fact, I think it would be safe to say that the Nusach Sfarad that Chassidim daven, or whatever, and that a lot of people daven, is primarily a Nusach Ashkenaz with some minor Sephardic influences, as opposed to being a Sephardic Siddur with some Ashkenazic influences. For example, and I'll just rattle off a few of these, but like in the Nusach Shemona Esrei, for example, in the Bracha of Re'ena, the Sephardim say Umar leGaleinu Geula Shlema. Nusach Ashkenaz is Galeinu Geula Shlema. In Roiv Sifrei Sephardim, Nusach Sephardim Roiv Nusach Sephardim Tzedorim, it's like the Ashkenazi version. In the Bracha of Re'enu, the Sephardim say V'Halei Arucha Umar L'Chol Tachlu Yeinu Chol Machaveseinu L'Chol Makesenu. In Nusach Ashkenaz is V'Halei Refuah Shlema L'Chol Makesenu. You look in most Chassidish Tzedorim, Nusach Sephardim Tzedorim, it's like Nusach Ashkenaz, and we could go down each bracha. There's many, many examples of this. So it's pretty clear that the Nusach Sephardim that most Hasidim and Hasidish background people are davening is primarily Nusach Ashkenaz with some minor fixes that make it suitable and to the Arizal's Nuschayos. Now, on the other hand, the Nusach Hari, the proper probably Nusach Hari, is a Nusach that's more Sfaradic, whether because that's what he was, like the Chum Sefer says, or whether because that's what his Talmidim were, in one way or the other. That's the Nusach that the Arizal was davening. So not exactly. Now, it's interesting is that in the Sefer Chassidim that describe the Nusach, and I guess we'll get up to this. There's a lot of interesting stories about the Nusach of Kaddish and the Nusach of the Tefillah. They seem to somewhat be referring to it as Nusach Hari, although it's not authentically Nusach Hari. Which means that the idea of the tikkunim and the fixes that the Chassidim were trying to implement, that the early rabbis were trying to implement in the Nusach HaSeder, seem to have been to accommodate the Arizal's kavanis and ideas in Tefillah. So although in Nusach it was not actually accurate to what the Nusach Hari was, that was the idea, was to accommodate those type of Nuschayos. Now, the one exception to this, like we opened up with, is the Siddur of the Alter Rebbe, Siddur, which he worked on tremendously, and in the Hakdamas that are written to it by him, by the Tzemach Tzedek, by the Rashab, in the various places that it's discussed, the work that the Alter Rebbe put into the Siddur, it's very clear that the Alter Rebbe himself was bothered by this idea, this sort of distinction, this sort of discrepancy, that the Nusach of the Tefillah that the Chassidim are davening is not Nusach Hari. It's some sort of Nusach Ashkenaz Meshubash, a Nusach Ashkenaz that has some minor changes to either go with the Nusach Hari or for other reasons, or some changes that are even ununderstandable, meaning some changes that the reason is not such really good pshat for. And the various Siddurim that it comes from are each one has different mistakes that are corrected later. So the Alter Rebbe himself seemed to have taken this very to heart and wanted very much to Misak and the Siddur make an actual Nusach Hari. So today, from the Chassidim, I could be wrong, but I think primarily the Chassidim that actually daven what we would call Nusach Hari is Lubavitch, and everybody else davens what's called Nusach Sfard. Now, regarding to the permissibility of changing Nusach, meaning that's a halacha shayla. How is it actually mutter to take a Nusach, take a minig that you have, a minig that a person has for deiris, and change it just to another minig? So now that's a great halacha shayla, and it's very, very relevant to the discussion of Nusach Sfard, which is the first time you would say that by and large there was wholesale changes, meaning the Arizal changed it. It was for Yechidim, for Yedei Chen, for Yedei for Lemdei Soid, who wanted to daven. So even if they came from an Ashkenazi background like the Hafla or Nassan Adler, so they'd be able to daven, along Nusach Hari. But people who were davening Nusach Hari, like the Guri Ari and the Talmidim, they were davening Nusach Sfaradim, which was an authentic primary Nusach. There was nothing wrong with that. When the Chassidim came, they changed it for the rank and file to daven Nusach Sfard. That became a boisterous halachic machlekes that Mitzvah will go into in some detail. But for now, let's leave it off with this little discussion of the Arizal's Nusach, and we'll continue on to Nusach Sfard, B'ezras Hashem. Now, it's rather interesting that the Gaon is another version of maybe a Kabbalistically oriented Nusach. According to some, according to others, it's mamish not. And maybe after Nusach Sfard, we could go into Nusach Hagra a little bit. Okay, shekayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.